outstanding favor. Yaqub got hold of a very important manuscript for me during my PhD research. So it's really nice to be able to return the favor finally. And it's also really exciting for me to be in the presence of Turkish scholars. There's so much important and interesting research being done at the moment and coming out of Turkey, both intellectual history and constructive theology. And I sincerely ask anyone present today who knows of any research that's relevant to my talk that's coming out soon in Turkish or has already come out, please do let me know, get in contact. I'd love to hear from you. I'm going to share my screen now. I have just a few slides. Here we go. Oops. Yeah, did that work?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, great. Now let me start the slideshow. Okay. Everybody see that okay? Brilliant. Okay. So the subject of today's talk is moving a little bit away from intellectual history. So we're thinking today about some of the insights that can be gleaned from Ibn Sina's philosophy, and most importantly, his metaphysics for modern scholars who are interested in the science-religion interface. So hopefully the importance of this topic is already readily obvious for anybody who's theologically minded. Science and the claims of the new atheists about what exactly science is and what science does present possibly the greatest challenge to theists, to believers, to theologians in our time. And this idea that science deals with hard facts and that religion deals with something intangible and ultimately indemonstrable reigns very strong, and particularly in the UK. And I don't know what the situation is in Turkey at the moment, so maybe you can share some of that afterwards. And I think it's very, very interesting then to consider what materials there might be within Islamic intellectual history to bring nuance and perhaps some challenge to some of the claims that are being touted. And to my mind, drawing on the tradition in this way is quite an important corrective to what we call, and I love this term, chronological snobbery that we sometimes notice in this discourse surrounding religion and science. And by this, I'm talking about the notion that's sometimes touted among modern philosophers of science that, you know, people used to believe in the supernatural, in immaterials, and ultimately in God, but, you know, now we know better. And taking the thought of these medieval philosophers seriously on its own terms, but also in conversation with the claims of modern people, helps to counter this claim. Because, of course, we find this great sophistication present in the thought of these theologians and philosophers. And just to give some context, the talk that I'm sharing today is based on some research I've done for a book project initiated by Dr. Shuaib Malik. And he works in the field of religion and science in Islam, and he's something of a pioneer in the field. And the book, which should hopefully be published later this year, collects the perspectives of 8 medieval Islamic thinkers representing traditions including Mu'tazilism, Ash'arism, Sufism, Hanbalism, and Maturidism. And Ibn Sina here is taken as the representative of the tradition of Falsafa. And I don't think we need to justify that too much, given his towering influence there. And funnily enough, when I was preparing for this talk, I realized that the majority of the contributors to this project are based in Turkey, which just adds credence to my claims earlier about the scholarly output from Turkey at the moment. And in this book, what we're trying to do is answer the question, as I've indicated, what insights does the study of these historical individuals' thought have to offer modern students of science and religion? So we're not looking to address specific questions in science and religion, but to tease out some of the important metaphysical insights which will underlie our answers to those questions. And that should become clear as I go along. But this is to say that I'm not proposing to answer the question of whether or not Ibn Sina would have endorsed evolutionary biology, for example, but instead to ask, could his understanding of the God-world relationship offer modern theologians some tools by which to correct some of the assumptions touted by modern scientists, for example, those who promote ontological naturalism, which is the belief that a scientist has to begin with the assumption that there are no supernatural or immaterial beings in existence. And I also just want to note very briefly that I'm not presenting here a constructive theology. I'm just bringing some observations on the contemporary relevance of Ibn Sina's thought. Okay, so these are and sorry, I should have had this slide up so you could have followed what I was saying more clearly, but I've mentioned all these things, and now I'll show you the claims that I plan to make in this short talk. The first is that Ibn Sina challenges some key binaries that are often assumed by philosophers of science, and specifically, he challenges this supposed dichotomy between empiricism and rationalism as ways of knowing, and also between scientific and religious truth-seeking. So these two realms of truth-seeking are supposed to be dichotomous. And then secondly, his metaphysical notion of the possibility of existence allows him to theorize and investigate an entirely coherent causal system made up of genuinely effective natural causes without ever compromising his belief in the supreme causal privilege of God, his supreme claim to be creator. Thirdly, I want to show that Ibn Sina exhibits epistemic humility with regard to religious and mystical experiences, without then going to make recourse to a God of the gap style explanation. He considers these kind of religious phenomena as attributable to causes within the causal system that he proposes, although we may not yet understand them. And finally, I'm going to hopefully show how he challenges some assumptions of modern philosophers of science in their conception of the natural. His interest in immaterial reality and his idea that immaterials can cause things in the universe around us, and which we might commonly describe as supernatural kind of way of thinking, doesn't actually compromise his science positive and truth-seeking scientific outlook. And two further observations before I try and argue a little bit for these claims. In my chapter and today, I refer to Ibn Sina's theological philosophy, and the reason for doing that, or the reason for framing Ibn Sina as a theologian, is a kind of thought experiment. Obviously, Ibn Sina has so much to say about the God-world relationship and the nature of God, and those aspects of his thought can't really be considered to represent anything other than theology. But there's this historical binary between the traditions of Hellenic philosophy, of falsafa, and Islamic theology, ilm al-kalam, and that can disguise the theological content of his thought. And so just for example, we have this philosophical theory of hylomorphism, that matter is continually, infinitely divisible on the one hand, and that's kind of identified with the philosophers. And then we have atomism on the other hand as the theory of the theologians. And so in that context, we might describe these as a philosophical and a theological theory. And of course, the question at hand is actually non-theological, just in the basic theory. And therefore, this binary is quite misleading. So the choice to describe him,
I can show them if you ask.
I have Siri in the background, sorry. The choice to describe him as a theologian is the attempt to kind of transcend these historical silos to bring out the relevant aspects of his thought. And then the second brief preliminary is that there's one particular metaphysical innovation that Ibn Sina makes that has enormous theological mileage and is critical for the way that he successfully reconciles observable regularities in the world and our ability to know them with the demands of revealed religion that it's God who ultimately grounds all reality. And this is the belief which most of you will be familiar with, and which also appeals to theological intuitions which were, of course, present among theologians as well, that all existence besides God are only possible in themselves. With respect to their own essences, they're neutral to existence. I exist. Equally, I might not exist. And indeed, there was a time when I didn't exist. But at the same time, all beings besides God are made necessary through their cause. So when their cause exists and there are no hindrances to the causation of that cause, to the efficacy of that cause, these beings have to exist by necessity. So all beings apart from God have this ontological duality. And that is crucial to many issues at the interface of science and religion. And I hope, again, that will become clearer. So on to my first claim. I claim that Ibn Sina brings a challenge to epistemological assumptions that are quite prevalent among modern philosophers of science. And one of the claims which is often touted is that empiricism is the only way to know anything, and that since religion deals with a kind of knowledge that cannot be empirically acquired, it's fundamentally incompatible with science. And this can lead into scientism. It doesn't always. And to my mind, one of the greatest lessons to be learned from Ibn Sina here is that the dichotomy between empirical and non-empirical rationalist ways of knowing isn't actually a given. And Dimitri Gutas has spilt a lot of ink in his claim that Ibn Sina was a straightforward empiricist. And he describes him even as a precursor to Locke in his empiricism. And then on the other hand, we have plenty of scholars who are on the other side of the debate. And most engagingly in recent years, we have Mohammed Zarapur, who contest that claim and point to the abstractionist elements in Ibn Sina's epistemology to show that he fundamentally believed that knowledge is acquired from on high via a process of emanation. So what did Ibn Sina believe? Well, he certainly believed that we can acquire knowledge of the world using the kinds of data and methods used by modern scientists, although of course within the limitations of his time. So within his list of the principles of knowledge, he includes as data types whose truth is known by necessity sense data, so what we collect every day from the particulars around us, and also the data that's acquired when through repeated experimentation, and he uses the term tajriba, and John McGuinness translates this as methodic experience, we come to determine the fact which makes the outcome of our experimentation true. So for instance, when we observe the fact that Skamany purges, we can acquire knowledge of the nature of Skamany. And such sense data is considered useful by Ibn Sina in the process of knowledge acquisition when it's combined with the tool of logic, properly applied. So it makes sense to think of Ibn Sina as an empiricist, as Gutas does, but it also seems to make sense to think of him as a rationalist. And this is partly because he believed that we have epistemic access to the universal realities of things. And indeed, this is what he thinks sets us apart from all other animals. He also believed that these universal forms, the true essences that underlie all the particulars around us, are bestowed from above, from the active intellect, when reasoning is complete. So this leads me to the point of view that we just have to admit that the binary between empiricism and rationalism didn't exist for Ibn Sina. And therefore, perhaps it's not this indubitable dichotomy that it's often perceived to be. So how does that work for Ibn Sina? Well, I've mentioned already the duality in the possible of existence between its essential possibility and its necessity through its cause. And here in epistemology, we find the first instance of the importance of this in securing a science-positive approach without in any way diminishing the role of God. So the process of collecting data and placing it in syllogistic forms to arrive at universal truths is, from an ontological perspective, a preparatory process by which the human will then be prepared to receive universals from the active intellect. By this empirical work that the human does, he or she prepares their mind, creating these specific contingencies, which are then made necessary through the action of the agent intellect. The possible, in essence, is made necessary from on high. And you can see here that you need both the top-down and the bottom-up processes for the acquisition of knowledge. So they're not incompatible. And so the scientific endeavor is strongly encouraged by Ibn Sina. And of course, he sees this even as the way to perpetual bliss in the afterlife. The acquisition of knowledge is everything for him. And knowledge is to be sought. Anything which hinders the process of knowledge seeking must be dealt with and eliminated from one's life. But this isn't seen to be in any way in conflict with the notion of revelation, of God giving knowledge. And indeed, his theory of prophecy is paradigmatic, really, of this attitude. So the prophet comes bearing this revelation of God, but he is precisely that individual whose intellection is most perfect in comparison to other humans. His intuition allows him to hit on the middle term of the syllogism so that he acquires the universal forms completely. So again, no trace of a conflict for Ibn Sina between this divine bestowal of revelation and the ordinary human pursuit of knowledge and of truth through empirical means. It just so happens that the prophet has perfected that ability to acquire knowledge. And at the very least, I think that Ibn Sina's position on this topic should cause us to question the assumption that the acquisition of truth via empirical means necessarily precludes revelation and other ways of acquiring knowledge. And then this second dichotomy, more briefly, between science and religion. Well, of course, Ibn Sina had no two separate data sets for the natural world and the divine. He used the same data and the same method in both fields. Now, of course, his proof for God begins from very minimal data, very minimal observation, namely that there are things in existence and that those things don't necessarily exist because we see them come to be and pass away and so on. So even though this is a very small amount of data and then a logical proof is built up that some would argue is entirely ontological, there is still no fundamentally different procedure to determine truths about God and his essence as attributes when compared with our procedure of learning truths about the properties of physical bodies. So there's this challenge to the notion of non-overlapping magisteria, to use Stephen Gould's term, that religion and science simply deal with different aspects of reality, and our knowledge about these two different aspects is not acquired in the same way. This kind of binary didn't exist for Ibn Sina, and of course that's true for many, if not all, medievals. It's ubiquitous across religious traditions, and that's until rather recent history, in fact. And I think it's worth noting as well that this isn't a merely kind of theoretical or rhetorical notion for Ibn Sina. He was a scientist. He extensively pursued the medical sciences, natural philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, and so forth. And in fact, often he received patronage on account of his medical expertise. So he wasn't some philosopher in an ivory tower casting philosophical judgments on what science does or on how we acquire knowledge of the natural world. He was a practicing science, and he was involved in this kind of experimentation that he described. And again, I just want to emphasize before moving on that the way in which Ibn Sina achieves this coherence here is again grounded in this duality within created beings. So let's move to my second claim. Oh, okay, I've done it again. I'm sorry. I had some guiding notes so that you'd be able to follow what I was saying a bit. I'll try not to do that for my second claim, which is that Ibn Sina's notion of possibility existence allows him to theorize and investigate a completely coherent causal system with genuinely effective natural causes without compromising God's privilege as ultimate creator and ultimate cause of the world. And this is perhaps, let's move on before I forget, one of the most interesting areas for us when we consider what we could learn from Ibn Sina about the relationship between religion and science. So unlike Aristotle, who declared the sufficiency of natural motions regressing ad infinitum as efficient causes of change in the cosmos, Ibn Sina actually believed that God was the ultimate efficient cause of the world. So he wasn't merely the end to which the world is moving, its final cause, but the source of its very existence. And in order to establish God's identity as efficient cause of everything else, he exploits this distinction between necessarily and possibly existent beings. So possible existence, as I've said repeatedly already, require a cause to determine that they exist. And it may well be that possible existent Y is determined by possible existent X as the more proximate efficient cause of its existence. Okay, so Ibn Sina, of course, doesn't deny that it's the conjunction of cotton with flame which produces combustion in the cotton. But such a process must, according to Ibn Sina, terminate in the existence of a being which exists necessarily. And his arguments for that point constitute his proof for God, and they've been the subject of plenty of analysis, and I won't rehearse the actual argument today. But Ibn Sina therefore insisted on the world's need for God, not as Aristotle's unmoved mover, but as a constant source of existence. And quite significantly, especially for his later reception, he describes this constant emanation as creation, ibda, and with various other terms. And he writes, in fact, that the cause which gives existence to its effect without delay beginning, or interruption is superior to that which brings its effect into existence after delay. And the term he uses is that such a cause is awla bil illiya, more worthy to be described as an illa, as a true cause. And furthermore, according to Ibn Sina, this kind of causation is most appropriately called creation, more appropriately than creation ex nihilo, as this is the implication, and that's constantly implicit. And he describes this kind of causation as the giving of existence to a thing after its absolute non-existence. تأييس الشيء بعد ليس مطلق. So there's a very deliberate attempt to harmonize the heritage of Hellenic philosophy with the exigencies of Quranic belief. And this is a really important feature of his discussions of the nature of the world's creation. So, for example, he develops, and this is most clear in the Isharat, in his pointers and reminders, the notion of al-huduth al-dhati, origination with regard to essence. And that's, again, designed to counter this kalam claim that the world's dependence upon God lies supremely in its originatedness, that at one point it didn't exist and then it came to exist. In contrast with God's eternality, that there has never been a time when he did not exist. Ibn Sina, by contrast, insists that there's a kind of huduth which is ontological. The necessary of existence, God precedes the world ontologically. And his favorite illustration here is the motion of a hand and the ring that it bears. The ring moves with the hand, but no one doubts that the hand is the cause of the ring's motion, and not the ring, as being the thing to cause the hand to move. And for our purposes, this is significant because it means that Ibn Sina can unproblematically maintain the genuine causal efficacy of a multitude of causes in all of the four categories: final, formal, material, and efficient, without ever compromising God's exclusive claim to the name creator. These causes may well be genuinely effective, but if it wasn't for God, they would have no existence at all. In their very essences, they require God to bestow existence upon them throughout the course of their own existence. And Thomas Aquinas, as Sevde, actually, you mentioned doing some research on the relationship between the Arab world and the Latin world. Thomas Aquinas borrowed heavily from Ibn Sina's ideas here. And actually, Ibn Sina's influence is already being revived in the revival by neo-Thomist philosophers of Aquinas' ideas of efficient causation. And in particular, these ideas are being used to challenge God of the gaps thinking, which is the idea that the theist has to look for an area of indeterminacy within nature in order to posit the action of a supernatural being. For Ibn Sina, this pursuit is simply wrong-headed, not only because God's action at the kind of head of the chain of emanation and as the grounds for all existence is completely compatible with an otherwise complete causal system, explicable within itself, but also because, as we shall see, he maintains that the apparent gaps in this system are in fact only gaps in our knowledge and our ability to comprehend causal processes. And we might also here then, through Ibn Sina, nuance the categories that modern philosophers of science use when describing various models for divine action. So Ibn Sina can be considered what we call a mere conservationist, which is to say that God merely conserves other causes in existence, but doesn't have a role in the actual process of their causation of further existence. Rather, he's built these causal capacities into their existence, and having done so, then supports their existence, but not their causation. So in that reading, God remains somewhat removed from particular existence, working through a network of causes arranged hierarchically. And as I said, these causes are genuinely effective, theoretically discoverable, but without the constant presence of God, of being outside this network, those causes wouldn't only be impotent, but they wouldn't exist at all. And Ibn Sina's very strong version of the nature of the world's ontological and ongoing dependence upon its cause should be emphasized here. And I think perhaps we could describe his as a very strong version of conservationism. And this is actually a very compelling model for the God-world relationship. It always has been. It was immediately for the theologians who followed Ibn Sina. And it's particularly apposite for those who are seeking to reconcile divine and natural causalities. And Davlat Derikhuda has worked a lot on this subject, and I really recommend his work in this regard. So my third claim takes up the subject of miracles and religious experience. And I want to show that Ibn Sina exhibits epistemic humility with regard to our understanding of such phenomena. Now, the question of miracles in Ibn Sina's thought occurs at something of a fault line. There seems to be a tension between what Olga Lizini neatly describes as the absoluteness of the causality of the principle in Ibn Sina's metaphysics and certain exigencies of revealed religion. So Ibn Sina's understanding of the way in which causes emanate from the necessary of existence is strongly determinist. It seems to demand an unvarying course of causality directly from God. If everything that comes to be, though, in the world does so by way of this necessary outworking of the causal chain which is initiated by God's pure existence, it would seem that there's little room for supernatural religious experiences, at least if we understand those experiences as a kind of direct divine departure from predictable and regular causal processes. But, and this could be surprising to somebody who is more familiar with Ibn Sina via Al-Ghazali's critique, Ibn Sina actually calls those who reject the reality of religious experiences, attested by ordinary folk and also mystics, pseudo-philosophers, and mutashabiha bi-falasifa. And for his own part, he affirms the reality of prophetic miracles. He affirms that petitionary prayer is truly effective, and more. And he writes as follows: know that most of what the populace confesses, takes refuge in, and upholds is true. So like the rational theologians of his time, he sees the miracles performed by the prophets as evidence of their status. And his Pointers and Reminders is particularly well known for its concentrated and affirmative treatment of mystical experience. But Jules Janssen has shown, partly through extracts from a very early treatise called Kitab al-Bir wal-Ithm, that the notion that Ibn Sina's thought gradually took on a more mystical dimension is a myth, and that actually his affirmation of the reality of religious experience was a constant from the start. So then he needs some creativity here. Explaining religious experiences, including miracles, for a philosopher committed to necessitarianism, demands this kind of creativity. And Ibn Sina rises to the challenge with his typical ingenuity, but also something slightly more anomalous for him, with an expression of humility concerning the reaches of reason. So Ibn Sina has a very well developed theory of prophetic miracles, which is embedded in his more general psychology. The soul is, according to Ibn Sina, the perfection of the body. And in this capacity, it has some power to shape, govern, and influence the body through images which are produced in the faculty of imagination. So on a relatively mundane level, we can understand this through the example of a sick person who is very determined to get better. And that determination at the psychological level affects her physical health and makes her better. Now, prophets have strong and noble souls which are better conformed to the likeness of their principle, the active intellect, and thus they're able to exceed the normal remit of the soul's influence, affecting things which are external to them. And Ibn Sina gives examples of healing a sick person, of, other than oneself, of receiving rain, on, praying for rain, seeking rain, and it begins to rain. So prophetic miracles then, according to Ibn Sina, are a function of the uniquely developed nature of the prophet's motive faculty, al-quwa al-muharrika, which itself is a natural feature common to all humans. And Professor Rahim Ajar has written on this, and he's said everything that needs to be said on this topic, and he's described this as a naturalistic explanation of miracles, and I really recommend his papers on the subject. More broadly, when Ibn Sina takes in the subject of miraculous occurrences associated with kind of religious experiences, like mystical experiences, the phenomena of talismans, the evil eye, those kinds of things. He seeks similar explanations, but he doesn't claim to have attained all these explanations. And this, I think, is quite significant. In a passage which actually concludes the whole of the Isharat, the whole of the pointers and reminders, Ibn Sina affirms the reality of magic, prophetic wonders, talismans, and so on. He suggests causes for each, but he ultimately recommends his reader not to allow their cleverness, tagayus, to cause them to deny that for which proof is not yet available, but whose impossibility that they can't demonstrate either. And this is how he concludes the whole work. He writes, "Know that there are wonders." Yeah, this is what he says. There are wonders in nature. And he goes on, "The active celestial powers, along with the passive sublunar powers, conjoin to produce extraordinary things." So events which appear to contravene the otherwise constant rules of nature are, according to Ibn Sina, explicable as effects of causes which are part of the natural order. Now, there's a caveat here. Of course, contrary to a modern secular worldview, this natural order is taken to comprise both material and immaterial realities. And this speaks to Ibn Sina's view of the kind of causal cohesion between the realms. Nevertheless, neither the prophetic wonders nor everyday religious experiences are produced by the direct intervention of God. So mysterious events which contravene these normally observed processes do occur, and rather than deny them because they appear to contravene the laws of nature, we should exercise some humility. The limitations of our knowledge concerning how such events come about shouldn't lead us to say that they're impossible. Neither, though, does the limitation of our knowledge about the underlying causes of such events indicate that they must be directly caused by God, as a departure from these regular causal processes. Rather, there may be causes we don't understand yet, because nature holds much wonder. And put this way, it seems that Ibn Sina considers nature itself to be replete with mysteries, which, although they're not special cases of unmediated divine action, speak together of the providence of their cause. So without any exception to his scheme of causal determinism, his discussion of miracles occasions expression of this level of humility that's otherwise absent from his philosophical project. And we know how optimistic Ibn Sina is epistemologically, and especially it has to be said concerning his own capacities, and his autobiography speaks of that, but in general about human capacity to know. He's very optimistic. So it's interesting that there's this area of humility here. And I think this point is important for modern day scientists. I think it recommends an approach to the relationship between science and religion where the sociological phenomena of religion, including the testimony of religious people about their experiences, can cause the scientists to admit that things which aren't yet explicable naturalistically shouldn't just be dismissed out of hand. But conversely, it also offers a corrective to divine action models which seek areas of indeterminism in nature. So looking for causal joints where there's a gap, where we can posit that God must have caused this because we don't know what else did. That's not what Ibn Sina does either. On his view, God doesn't need to interrupt the series of events of which he is anyway the ultimate efficient cause in order for these abnormal events to occur. Okay, final claim is that Ibn Sina challenges modern scientists in their ideas of what natural means and what the natural is. So his interest in the immaterial and his way of attributing causal efficacy to beings which we might commonly describe as supernatural doesn't compromise his science positive and truth-seeking outlook. So let's look at this a little bit closer. There's various forms of methodological naturalism. Some exclude the appeal to supernatural causes within a scientific inquiry on the basis that science is actually incapable of dealing with claims of the supernatural. Others insist that science can engage with such claims in the same way that it would engage with any other claim about how things are caused, but basically that scientists shouldn't waste their time doing that. And the idea here is this belief that over time supernaturalism has simply failed as an explanation of natural phenomena. And many seem to simply assume here materialism, which is, and what I mean by that is that the existence of phenomena which are not constituted in matter or in energy should simply be eliminated from the scientific inquiry altogether. And I think Ibn Sina's definition of nature needs to be recalled here. He describes nature as that which is the active principle of motion, change, and rest within bodies. Among modern philosophers of science, natural is quite often taken as synonymous with material, so that many of Ibn Sina's posited causes would be considered supernatural by default. For Ibn Sina's causal system does feature immaterial causes at almost every level. So his principles of motion, rest, and change include, for instance, the vegetative, animal, and rational souls, which are all immaterials. Now, the reason this is interesting for us is that many modern methodological naturalists assume that if we posit the existence of immaterial beings, we're exhibiting this inherently supernaturalist way of thinking. We're making appeal to something beyond nature in order to explain that which we just don't understand yet. And that's absolutely not what's happening in Ibn Sina's thought. By Ibn Sina's own definition, these immaterial entities were entirely natural in the sense that they produced motion, change, and rest in regular, predictable, and necessary ways, which were theoretically discoverable. So when he makes appeal to the explanatory capacity of these powers, he's not making some kind of escape to the supernatural in the absence of evidence, but this is part of a coherent effort to understand the predictable causal structures of the universe. And we are in the position to exclude many of Ibn Sina's immaterials, but it certainly serves as a warning against dismissing the contributions of these medieval metaphysicists on the grounds that their explanations were supernatural, because what they were doing might not be what we assume they were doing in appealing to these immaterial entities. Ibn Sina's immaterials were not for him divine interruptions. They were part and parcel of an ordered system. And Michael Ruse's definition of the natural is interesting here. He describes the natural as the repeatable, that which is governed by law. And that might allow for the inclusion of Ibn Sina's immaterial principles of change, even within a modern definition of natural. All this to say that medieval philosophers shouldn't be dismissed as essentially anti-scientific on the basis that they believe in immaterial beings. And furthermore, there remain phenomena within our experiences now that cannot yet be described materialistically, that haven't yet been explained materialistically. Consciousness is a notoriously difficult problem for science. Some scientists are of the opinion that will simply one day be explained in the way that gravity has been. And they make this analogy, which I think is problematic, but this is how they understand the problem of consciousness. But at present, this is at least an open question as to whether or not consciousness will be explained as a material process. So for all of our undoubted scientific progress, we're still not in the position where we can conclusively eliminate the action of immaterials in the universe. That's just hubris, if a scientist is of that opinion. To my mind, therefore, it's an instance of chronological snobbery to assume that medieval philosophers like Ibn Sina were fundamentally supernaturalist simply because they include these immaterials. However, and I am coming into land here, I won't go on for much longer. Having said that these immaterials are natural to Ibn Sina, he was constantly making an appeal to a cause outside the system. So on his own terms, all observable effects are strictly speaking both natural in that they can be explained in terms of a power, quwwa, within bodies, and supernatural in that they couldn't exist without more remote immaterial causes, supremely God. And he's striking a middle ground there between the peripatetic belief in natures, which were autonomous powers responsible for all substantial change, and kalam occasionalism, wherein there's no natural principle of change, but only patterns caused by the habitual action of God. So he readily acknowledged the reality and investigability of natural causes, and at once he acknowledges that all causes owe their very existence to God. And belief in immaterials doesn't compromise his scientific method in this regard. And again, it's just worth emphasizing that this principle that God's causal presence can be said to underlie on other causes is deeply theologically compelling and has been immediately was for the very first Mutakallimun following Ibn Sina. And again, this is grounded in his metaphysical belief in the duality within created beings. So finally, I just conclude with a couple of reflections on where Ibn Sina's legacy in these areas might take us. I've said that Ibn Sina rarely acknowledges the limitations on human reason, given his epistemological optimism. So it's telling that his only acknowledgement of the limitations to discover the causes of things arises when he treats religious experience. But for Ibn Sina, this was no less of a scientific mystery than any other phenomena that he observed. It wasn't a mystery in a kind of supernatural sense. It was just an unexplained phenomenon in the natural order. And this provokes his exclamation concerning the wonders in nature. And to me, this commends an attitude of humble truth-seeking in both of the realms of science and religion. An attitude which doesn't diminish the incredible advances in scientific discovery which are constantly being made, but also doesn't diminish and deny the reality of religious experiences and associated convictions. For Ibn Sina, these realms were one and the same, and we might be more sensitive now to the differences in the data that's available for these realms of inquiry, but we shouldn't be insensitive to the mystery and the wonder that's common to both. So I am really interested now to hear your feedback on my ideas. Also, if anyone wants to tell me, if some of the things I've said about are true of Turkey at the moment, as well as of the UK. These attitudes are very, very prominent popularly in the UK. So yeah, I'm interested to hear anything anyone has to share with me. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hassan, for the thought-provoking presentation. And now we're going to move on to Q&A session. If you have any questions, please do raise your hand so I can just see you. And also, you can write your question in the chat section so I can read them. You can ask in English, or if you have any problem with that, you can ask in Turkish so we can translate them. And these are all possibilities. And also, please do try to be precise as much as possible so that we can have as many questions as possible. And so let's see. Questions? Dr. Ramazan, Yasin Ramazan, I think he has a question, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Laura, for this great presentation. And I actually did my PhD on the subject, but I just wondered if you have come across with any occasion on Ibn Sina's work on the causation in the social realm. Like what? Okay, like this concerns what you explained concerns the sciences in the natural sciences sense, like in the sense of physical sciences. But how about the scientific outlook of humanities? Have you seen any occasion where Ibn Sina offers explanation over like public order or interactions between like people, political, etc.? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good question. I hope I've understood it properly. So, and I don't know if you're slightly getting at the subject of moral determinism and, how the causal order helps us to understand how to behave in a society. Does that slightly, because so all of this is explained within the same kind of naturalistic framework. Society, we need a legislator, we need a lawgiver, we need a society because of our nature as humans. So our goal as humans is to acquire knowledge of universals, as I've said. That's our supreme goal. That's the goal of humanity as a whole. And because we are also animals in a sense, living with other humans, we are required to cooperate and work together, so that you need then legislation about marriage, about trade, all of these kinds of things. The lights have gone off for some reason. There we go. And so for that reason, a lawgiver and a legislator has been provided, supremely the prophet, of course. So it's all explained within the same kind of comprehensive framework of existence and an understanding of what we're here for and what the world is about. I don't know if that gets at your question.
Yeah, just a slight thing. Like when we think of religion, we tend to believe that this is a matter of human choice or like free will in the general sense. But Ibn Sina barely touches this connection. Like, how is this? I just wonder what you think about it, actually. How is this sits in Ibn Sina's project? Like, where does it sit?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question, and partly it can be answered in quite a I don't know how to put it. Ibn Sina didn't believe in free will at all. There isn't any room for human free will within this very tightly determined universe. Certainly not in the case of the human, and he didn't try to justify human free will. We're governed by the conjunction of our circumstances and various other things within us and within our environment. He did try to justify God as a volitional agent, and he did that in a different way. But in terms of religion, I don't know that he treats it at any length, but I might be wrong. But he was a deeply religious person, and he certainly believed religion to be a real thing, a real experience, and something God-given for human benefit, and ultimately to help us achieve this perpetual bliss. But in terms of how that varies between societies, and why some people have access to certain revealed religions and others don't, I don't know what he would have said.
Okay, thank you.
We have 2 more questions in the chat. I'll read them. The first one is from Dr. Said, and his question is like this. To what extent Ibn Sina borrowed from Aristotle's metaphysics, and did he actually extend on his thoughts, or he had differences with Aristotle's philosophy? Also, is it necessary to read Aristotle to understand Ibn Sina's philosophy? This is the first question. And we can go on to the second question after you answer this, if you like to.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, so good question. So very interestingly, Ibn Sina saw himself essentially as an Aristotelian philosopher, and that's partly because a lot of the texts that were translated into Arabic, even those which were Neoplatonic and not originally Aristotelian, were actually attributed to Aristotle. So he was heavily influenced by the Neoplatonists, but often he saw himself as a straightforward inheritor of Aristotelian philosophy. And so that's important for his own self-image. And how then does he represent Aristotle? Well, his Kitab al-Shafa, his most important and biggest philosophical compendium, is styled as a commentary on Aristotelian philosophy, and he follows the structure of Aristotle's works, and he follows him in a huge number of topics. So just to give that example that I mentioned at the beginning, hylomorphism, he follows Aristotle. That's not to say that he simply agrees with him, and he often doesn't. So he doesn't agree with him entirely on corporeality, for example. So he goes with the general theory of hylomorphism, but he has a different theory of how corporeity is constituted, for example. And the same with his theory of causality. He's deeply influenced by he doesn't question, well, not that he doesn't question it, but he accepts the four causes. But he doesn't accept that God is only the final cause of the world. So, you know, he's hugely innovative, and a lot of that is in response to the Quran and his Islamic context and environment. But broadly, he sees himself as continuing this Aristotelian heritage in an Islamic context. I hope that helps. Is it necessary to read Aristotle? Probably a little bit. It helps. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much. For the next question is from Dr. Kayhan Zaykal, and he is asking, thank you for the talk. Is it possible to say that, according to Ibn Sina, all marvels or miracles are explainable by science, at least in principle, if it develops sufficiently? Also, is there any space for divine intervention in his philosophy? This was the question.
Thank you very much. Yes, to the first question, it is certainly possible in principle for that Ibn Sina would support this, that I mean, there isn't a kind of non-scientific explanation of anything for him. He doesn't think of it in those terms. So any miracle will ultimately be explicable, but we might not be able to determine which are the causes at work. And divine intervention, again, it's a kind of the term is sort of incompatible with Ibn Sina's way of looking at the world. Everything is a divine intervention and nothing is a divine intervention. Everything is there because of God's constant presence. But no, he doesn't intervene in the causal process once it's begun to unfold. And that's partly because Ibn Sina believes that God's transcendence is really constituted in his being the necessary of existence, and which means that he's immaterial, spaceless, timeless, and can't be involved in the particulars. And obviously Al-Ghazali had a big problem with this. But yeah, so it would be below God to intervene in particulars. And in fact, you know, dare I put it like this, and this would be how Al-Ghazali would put it, Ibn Sina's God wouldn't be able to, because he stands outside, he's apart from the causal order in that way. But an Avicenna might like to disagree on that point.
Thank you very much. We have either a question or a contribution, but I'll read it anyway. So Aisha said, thank you for the thought-provoking insights. I'm interested in the sociological implication of the concept of God's knowledge of particulars as presented by Ibn Sina. Contrary to his thoughts, our present religious paradigm is juxtaposed on the conception of a highly micromanaging God, which creates a lot of sociological problematics. I don't know if you'd like to comment on this, or...
Well, I'd be interested to I don't know if Aisha can speak at the moment, but just exactly what those sociological problems might be. But yeah, so yeah, certainly, I mean, this is the subject of a lot of my research before this project, is comparing and contrasting Asherism with its obviously highly alternative understanding of how God acts in the world. And yes, but there is ground in between Avicennism and Asherism for God's action. You know, we don't have to either, to my understanding, we don't have to either say that God's not involved in particulars at all, or that he constantly controls them all. There's ground in between. But I'd be interested if there's a specific question about that as well. But thank you for the comment.
Thank you very much. And we have another question. I think this is the last question we're going to take because we are running out of time. So thanks for the talk. What do you think will be Avicenna's position on evolution? This is an interesting question. Okay.
Yes, thank you. And again, interested to hear other people's points of view. I actually don't really want to venture an answer to that question. Although I have to say that in his discussions of chance, Ibn Sina is very strongly opposed to people who see chance as an ontological cause. So, and that is relevant to the discussion of evolution. There were philosophers who actually, in you know, ancient philosophers, I think, who, oh, thank you for your comment, I've just seen that, who maintained that a lot happened, within the development of humanity by chance, in a theory that somewhat mirrors modern evolutionary theory. And Ibn Sina wasn't keen on that idea at all. He saw chance as an epistemic thing. It's only from our perception that things occur by chance, and actually they're highly ordered. But I'm not sure that evolutionary biology is incompatible with his understanding of causation, because in theory, God can produce anything in any way through his eternal emanation of existence. But I have no idea if he would accept it. Perhaps being a science positive and progressive kind of thinker, he would have, but it's all speculation, to be honest.
I think for this question, there's a related content we have produced with Dr. Shuaib Ahmed Malik. He has presented for us as well, and his explanations were basically generally based on Ash'ari position. The one who asked the question, he can actually go on to YouTube channel and check his talk on evolution and Islam. I think that will be helpful to see the framework. And can we take one more question, or wouldn't that be feasible for you?
That's fine. I'm reading the question at the moment.
Okay, then.
Yes, go for it.
I am a medical doctor, and I want to understand Ibn Sina's cosmological medicine and how he built his medical theories on his philosophical ontology. Would reading Kitab al-Shifa help in this regard, or should I check any other books, papers in this regard?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think the Kitab al-Shifa really helps here, but I would like to go away and find out for this person. So I would leave my contact details, and perhaps I can get back to the doctor on that. I'm not too sure, to be honest.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Lara Hassan, for joining us today on the Department of Istanbul University Faculty of Theology. We are delighted to have you here, and hopefully we'll meet you in future in Flesh and Blood at Istanbul or somewhere else. And thank you for our audience for joining us today and on this wonderful talk. If you don't have any other further things to add, I would like to close the session and also not take too much time from Dr. Hassan. And thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and everyone for attending. Goodbye. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Shall I leave my contact in the chat here?
That would be great, but they can actually access you through your university.
You can use my academia page, but I'll just leave it here if anybody.
All right. Okay.
I'm interested in questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for the presentation.